to all of you. Resuming debate, the honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise this afternoon in opposition to Bill C-6, an act to amend the Citizenship Act. Let me say at the outset that Canada is a country built upon immigrants. People come from all corners of the world, people of all backgrounds, all ethnicities, all faiths, and all creeds, people who come here to build a better life for themselves and their families. And as a result of their contribution, they help shape in building a better Canada each and every day. Mr. Speaker, hundreds of thousands of new Canadians are welcomed into the Canadian family each and every year. Indeed, as a result of important reforms to Canada's immigration system brought forward by the previous Conservative government, a record number of new Canadians are welcomed into the Canadian family in more than 70 years. And I would say, Mr. Speaker, that is a record that all Canadians can be proud of. Mr. Speaker, each time an immigrant is welcomed into the Canadian family as a Canadian citizen, we are all enriched by the ever-increasing diversity of Canada. And it is precisely because of that, Mr. Speaker, that I stand vigorously in opposition to Bill C-6. You see, Mr. Speaker, Bill C-6 does absolutely nothing to help the hundreds of thousands of good people who are waiting in the immigration line to build a new and better life in Canada. Rather, Bill C-6 primarily helps one individual, and that individual's name is Zachariah Amera. Zachariah Amera, the ringleader of the Toronto 18. Yes, that's Zachariah Amera. Someone who built detonators, someone who acquired explosives to build truck bombs to blow up downtown Toronto, someone who was responsible for a plot that the trial judge of Amera characterized as spine-chilling. And what's more, the trial judge determined that but for the fact that Amera was stopped in his tracks, that plot, if carried out, would have resulted in a loss of life on a scale never before seen in Canada. Mr. Speaker, Amera's citizenship was rightly revoked under the previous Conservative government, and now, if Bill C-6 is passed, Amera's citizenship would be reinstated. You see, what Bill C-6 effectively does is it puts Amera at the front of the immigration line ahead of the hundreds of thousands of law-abiding people who want to join the Canadian family.
Not surprising.
You know, I agree with the honourable members opposite when they say that a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian. And I would add that a law-abiding Canadian is a law-abiding Canadian is a law-abiding Canadian. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? A terrorist is a terrorist is a terrorist. But Bill C-6 does nothing to create equality, to treat newcomers equally. Rather, and I concede that the government's bill may be well-intentioned, but what Bill C-6 effectively does is it gives dual citizens convicted of terrorist offences preferred status over other dual citizens. Mr. Speaker, what happens to a dual citizen who conceals their criminal record? The answer is that their citizenship may be revoked, and this government supports that. What happens to a dual citizen who enters Canada on fraudulent pretenses? The answer is that their citizenship may be revoked, and this government supports that. But what happens to a dual citizen who is convicted of terrorist offenses? Well, Bill C-6 is passed, they would be able to keep their Canadian citizenship. Mr. Speaker, how can that be? How is that fair? How is that just? How is that fair to, frankly, multi-generation Canadians, to first-generation Canadians, to new Canadians, to any Canadian? Mr. Speaker, it's not fair. It's fundamentally unjust, particularly to dual Canadian citizens. And not only is it fundamentally unjust to dual Canadian citizens, it's out of step with literally every other country in the Western world. Almost every country in the Western world has laws on their books that take away the citizenship of those who perpetrate terrorist acts. It's out of step, Mr. Speaker, with literally every democracy in the Western world because Bill C-6 is inconsistent with the principles that underlie citizenship, namely reciprocity. Canada is loyal to the citizen is loyal to Canada. And so, Mr. Speaker, let me just say that I hope that the government takes a step back and reconsiders this ill-advised piece of legislation. Rather than moving forward with this legislation, I would encourage them to work with us, work with all parties, work with all Canadians to find ways to help streamline the immigration process, to find ways to give immigrants tools that they need so that they can prosper here in Canada, and to frankly work to help every new Canadian enjoy the Canadian dream by creating conditions for long-term growth and prosperity instead of the reckless tax and spend schemes that they have brought forward over the last 6 months that are slowing economic growth, including of new Canadians, making us all poorer and burdening future generations of Canadians, including future generations of new Canadians, with mountains and mountains and mountains of debt. And so in closing, Mr. Speaker, let me say that a bill that puts terrorists ahead of dual Canadian citizens, a bill that is inconsistent with long-standing principles respecting citizenship, and a bill that would put one of the worst terrorists, Zachariah Amera, at the front of the immigration line, is a bill that must be defeated.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. Alors, la députée d'Argenteuil, la Petite Nation.
The honourable member for Argenteuil, la Petite Nation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank my colleague for his speech, and I would also like to thank him for the same speech he gave in his introduction on welcoming refugees to Canada. And this more or less corresponds with what we have in our lines here. However, it seems that the same issue keeps on coming back with a vengeance because my colleague is trying to scare Canadians with some of the things he's saying when he talks about terrorists and other such things. So what I'm wondering today, well, he said that a citizen is a citizen, so how can he say in the same breath? So he says a citizen, it is citizen. And then he also says that he's in favor of dual citizenship. Can you explain that?
Mr. Speaker, when someone commits terrorist acts, when someone seeks to kill other Canadians, when someone seeks to destroy the institutions that bind us as Canadians, that individual, as a matter of fact, renounces their citizenship. What the Strengthening of Canadian Citizenship Act did was merely affirm that fact. What Bill C-6 does is it seeks to revoke that renunciation and reinstate it solely to the benefit of terrorists. We think that that is fundamentally wrong, and it's why we don't support Bill C-6.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Burnaby South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the passion with which my colleague speaks, and I think it adds greatly to this debate. I'm just wondering if he can tell me perhaps where he's been vigorously defending C-24. I get a sense from the questions and the speeches that perhaps they didn't go far enough for the member. I'm wondering if he can envision a bill that would be stronger than C-24 that he'd perhaps like to see replace this C-6. Thank you.
The honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Bill C-6 falls short just about in every which way imaginable. Take, for example, the fact that under the Strengthening of Canadian Citizenship Act, we recognized that new Canadians, applicants, an increasingly globalized world, need flexibility to, and so what we've done, what the Strengthening of Canadian Citizenship Act did was, in terms of the period of time that they were required to remain in Canada, we gave them 1/3 of that time in which they could be outside of Canada in recognition of that, the need for flexibility. What the Liberals now want to do is take away that flexibility by reducing the amount of time to only 25% of the time that those applicants could be outside of Canada. So this legislation is bad for new Canadians. Frankly, the only beneficiaries of it are terrorists.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable member for West Nova.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite mentioned in his speech that this bill does nothing to help the long line of immigrants waiting to become citizens. But of course, Bill C-6 proposes to reduce the number of days needed for international students by reinstating the 50% of their time here credit. It also reduces the time they are in Canada from 4 out of 6 to 3 out of 5 in order to apply as citizens. Therefore, I'd ask my friend if he would agree with me that these measures do, in fact, help those who do want to become citizens and to reduce the waiting time. Thank you.
The member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Mr. Speaker, there are some aspects of Bill C-6 that are positive. I will admit that not all aspects of this bill are bad. And so we need to look at those changes carefully. Unfortunately, there are too many provisions in Bill C-6 that are problematic, and so barring the legislation being drastically amended, I and my colleagues in the Conservative Party cannot support it.
Resuming debate.